Friends, will you pray with me? And as you feel so comfortable, I invite you to join in the second time through. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God. Amen. So here we are, Palm Sunday, coming towards the end of our Lenten journey, which this year we have focused on, called creation care or climate justice. And this Palm Sunday, this celebration, the waving of palm, I guess we didn't wave any palm branches, but in many churches there's a whole procession, there's lots of waving. And this was most likely first celebrated with palms in northern Italy, sometime in the 8th century. And then it was adapted, Rome, the churches in Rome thought that was a pretty good idea. They adapted it and began blessing the palms, and so it has carried forth since then. During our time studying and learning about climate justice and creation care and how churches can be involved in this, some of you have followed along with the devotional that we had this year by Dr. Leah Shade, and some of you have joined in with the Bible study where we looked at different texts and different, there were 4 parts of the earth, of the elements that we looked at and sort of studied the Bible. But one of the things for me that came up that I found, that I learned about, was a theologian named Ched Myers, who has written a lot about creation care and climate justice and how churches can be involved in that. Ched comes out of the Anabaptist or Mennonite tradition, which has a long history of justice work. And one of the things that he writes about is a shift, actually, from this idea of creation care or climate justice to something he calls watershed discipleship. And there's 3 parts to that, but one of the parts is that a watershed is a particular area around a body of water, and our faith is an incarnational faith, so an embodied faith, which is particular to a time and place. So in other words, Jesus had a body, right? We all agree with this. Jesus had a body, was walking the earth in a human body in a particular place in the world and during a particular time, and therefore Christianity is best practiced in a similar way. He writes, a critical task for today's church is to take up a replaced theology. That is, to reclaim symbols of redemption that are indigenous to the bioregion in which the church dwells, to remember the stories of the peoples of the land, and to sing anew its old songs. These can be woven together with the symbols, stories, and songs of biblical radicalism. It says developing a watershed ecclesiology, and I'm throwing out a big church word again there. Basically that means sort of the way of doing church, involves consciously rethinking our collective habits, large and small. We focus so much on the place where Jesus lived and this place where a lot of our holy stories and biblical stories come from, and we call it the Holy Land. But really, this too, the land in which we live and worship, is also just as holy. Now, these palms that we see every year on this Sunday in Lent, traditionally they come from Latin America, from Guatemala, Belize, Mexico. Some come from Tanzania now. Usually those are ones that are already pre-folded into the cross. I see somebody made theirs into a cross already, and we've got directions if you want to attempt that I'm still not really good at it, but so those are usually pre-folded. You don't want to put in the effort. And some we get from the United States, Texas, Florida, Arizona, California. We have over 300 million palms that are harvested just for the United States for Palm Sunday. And most of those are in completely unregulated ways. So the people harvesting them are just harvesting as many as they can to get as much money for their work. Now there is something called eco palms, which some of you may have heard of, but this was actually very recent, started in 2005 by someone in Minnesota who started questioning how we get our palms and how sustainable it is to have that many palms harvested without questioning how it's done. And so that program ensures sustainable harvesting practices, ensures the workers are paid fairly, but not a lot of churches use them because they cost more. And also, they're not these palms, they're those palms. So you get a big palm branch to wave and you can't fold it into a cross like most of us are used to. So that also is an impediment for churches adapting the eco palms, is people want the palms they're used to. Now, growing and harvesting palms by itself is not necessarily a terrible thing. Keeping palms growing does help protect the rainforest, because probably the other option, if they weren't harvesting palms, they would just cut all the trees down and open it up to agriculture, which is not all great. So there is some benefit to having palms, a market for palms being sold. But if, as Chedmeyer suggests, we ought to consciously rethink our habits and traditions to establish our theology in the place in which we practice and live out our Christianity, what might this mean for Palm Sunday? Also, listen again to the text from today, this text from Matthew. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. Do you hear any mention of palms? John, in fact, is the only version of this story that specifically mentions palm trees and palm branches. Everybody else says they went and cut branches or gathered branches from the fields to use in their parade, in their procession. In other words, they used what was available in that place at that time. And if you've ever seen a palm branches growing, they probably weren't gathering actually a lot of palm branches, but more like olive branches or the grasses that were growing at the time. Okay, so what if we did the same thing? So I grew up in New Hampshire, not too far from here, an hour away. I did not see a palm tree in person until I studied abroad in Barcelona in high school. I literally walked out of the airport and was like, oh, a palm tree! All right, so I was from small town New Hampshire, like in a European city for the first time, and got off my first 2 airplane flights ever. But palm trees are just not a New Hampshire thing, right? But what about fir and pines and willow, which has a nice waviness to it? Even rhododendrons, which are green this time of year and are native. We have cedar, we have some fern. Oops. Let's see. These are a little crispy because I harvested these a couple days ago before the rain came. But we have, when the snow, 3 feet of snow is not on top of them, we have ferns this time of year that are still green. What if these were our branches of celebration? in Hancock. Jesus' procession that we hear about every year for this Sunday was street theater. It was meant to contrast with the Roman military parade that was happening on the other side of town, with horses and, big military stuff. It was a protest, a statement, one more act of the "you see it has been this way, now let me show you my way." Jesus refusing to follow traditions and rules just because. And yes, it upset a lot of people. What if we consciously and intentionally removed ourselves from the expectation that Palm Sunday has to involve the environmental impact that harvesting and shipping palm strips requires? That's the expectation, not that we do it, expectation. What if our focus on Palm Sunday was more on Jesus' message than on one particular plant that happens to be mentioned in one version of the story of this act of resistance? Perhaps we might rename the Sunday to Procession Sunday. I saw one writer who asked this question in Maine, thought it might be Coats and Branches Sunday, although she questioned the, throwing our coats down the aisle for those to, process on. Or we might expand to wrap in some of those texts that we read on Maundy, Thursday that so many people skip over, and call it Passion Sunday, which many churches do. Or something else. Now, this is not in any way an announcement that next year we are not going to have palms at all. It's a reminder that nothing says we have to except tradition. And that it could be potentially quite meaningful to celebrate this day in a way that connects us to this particular time and place, so that we might continue Holy Week in the same manner, reflecting not solely on the way Jesus, as a person, was rejected and crucified in that time and place long ago, but also on the systems of power, oppression, and crucifixion that are present here today. Amen.